Welcome to MidLIFE Matters, where we celebrate women's wisdom and wit. I'm Georgianne Lucier, your host, and I'm delighted to introduce today's guest, Janis Jerman, who applies her problem-solving skills to help people be their very best in a variety of situations using her legal background. Welcome, Janis.
Thank you, Georgianne. It's nice to be here.
Wonderful. And so you have a couple of roles right now that we're going to hear about. And one is a neutral or impartial arbitrator, and the other is a hearing officer. One's with the Connecticut Department of Labor, and one is with the Department of Education, correct?
Yeah, they're kind of two different roles in the sense that the hearing officer work is administrative hearings. So any
Okay.
agency that offers a hearing process would be a hearing officer situation. The arbitration would be more when parties contract for dispute resolution services. So that's kind
Okay.
of the distinction between the two different roles. But it's a similar type of situation of hearing a dispute and making a decision to resolve that for the parties.
Well, that's a heady thing to do, right? And I'm sure you need to engender some trust with the people that you're working with and have them really believe it is going to be impartial. So could you give us some examples for both roles of what would, be some of the work you're involved in?
Sure. So, for instance, you mentioned the Department of Education. So I have a variety of contracts with the Department of Education. So that could be special education cases, student expulsion cases, teacher license revocation, really anything that touches education.
Okay.
So, for instance, in a special education case, if a parent has a disagreement with a school over the provision of services for their child, then they have a right to go to a hearing. I think the thing that's important is that my role is to listen, to hear and understand what each side, what their position is and what they're saying, and then take all that evidence and apply it to the law, apply the law to it, and come up with a decision as to what is or is not an appropriate program for that particular child.
Do you feel you need to know a lot about education in order to make those judgments in that situation?
There's a lot, I think, that it's important to know and to understand. I think it's easy to hear somebody say, oh my gosh, my child has this disability or situation, and at school they are or are not getting this service, and to have a reaction to that. So it's really important to understand sort of the scope of what the child's disability is, to understand the scope of services that could be available, to understand different types of assessments, because if you can't assess the child and evaluate them appropriately, then how do you know if you're giving them the right program?
Right.
So there really are a lot of areas to understand. It's not just a matter of, here's the law, we're going to read this little thing and apply that. It's really a matter of understanding the scope of the disability, the types of services available, the types of assessments, and then obviously what the law is with regard to that situation.
So in that example, what would have preceded them coming to you in terms of they being the parents? What steps would they have, are they required to have had basically to get to the point where they can have this type of hearing?
Anytime a parent has a dispute, typically what we see is they work with the school and they try and resolve it, and at some point they can't come to an agreement, and then the parents have a right to file what's called a due process request, the Department of Education. They're not required to proceed to a hearing, but there are some other steps they can take, again, that are not required. So they may decide to go to mediation before going to a full hearing. So there are some options for parents, but I think mostly what we see is a parent and a school trying to work together to come to some resolution, and sometimes it just doesn't happen, and for a number of reasons. And so ultimately they end up in the due process, but a lot of those cases settle, whether it's through a resolution session, which is provided for by statute, or a voluntary mediation, or other settlement discussions. Most of those cases settle and don't actually get to a full hearing.
So for anyone that's listening who may think, gee, I didn't realize that even existed, would it be a matter of going on the Department of Education's website to see what this,
Yeah, so on the Department of Education website, they certainly have a lot of information about what a parent's and a student's rights are under the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act that covers special education. But I think it's true of a lot of agencies, not just Department of Education and special ed, but any agency that oversees functions or parts of our lives is that there is an opportunity when you have a disagreement. You go to the Department of Consumer Protection if you hired somebody to do home improvement work and they didn't do a good job and you
Right.
have a dispute with them, there's, resolution processes. So there's a lot of state agencies that offer these administrative hearings to help resolve issues.
Okay. So then are you a bit of an independent contractor, or you would be maybe on a list of people they could contact?
Yeah, so I am an independent contractor, and I have contracts with a number of different agencies to conduct hearings. And so they'll call or email and say, we have another one, are you available to take this case? And
Okay.
so I can take the case.
So how many of you are there out there, like in Connecticut?
There are not a lot. I think right now, for special education hearing officers, I think there's only about 5 or 6 of us right
Oh,
now.
okay.
So there aren't a lot. But there are a variety of, each agency has a different set of hearing officers. Some of them are actually state employees that work within the department. Some of them are
Okay.
independent contractors. It depends on the nature of the hearing. In terms of arbitrators, there's a lot of arbitrators out there.
Okay.
Some of them who are doing arbitrations for agencies, and a lot of them who are doing private arbitration. So between private parties, does not go through a state agency.
So you are in a select group. And unusual. All right. And so in terms of the Department of Labor, what would an example there be?
The cases that I do for the State Board of Mediation and Arbitration, which is a division of the Department of Labor, are union grievances.
Okay.
So for example, let's say a police officer is terminated or suspended or has some sort of discipline and they are going to grieve that. Then it goes through the grievance steps pursuant to the collective bargaining agreement, and ultimately they can go to arbitration. It could also be a disagreement with a provision of a collective bargaining agreement, number of vacation days that they're entitled to,
Yeah.
or how you interpret a certain provision. So any grievance under the collective bargaining agreement goes through that process.
Okay. What are some of the barriers to reaching a satisfactory conclusion to this process? I mean, we're all humans, and right? People get kind of in their lane or their thought process.
From the arbitrator standpoint, is that it's really important to listen, to hear all of the evidence, to ask questions if you're not clear on it, to understand it, to give the parties an opportunity, to fully present their case, to be able to then go and evaluate that evidence thoroughly, to understand it, to be looking at the collective bargaining agreement and know this is what the requirements are, how do I apply those facts
Right.
to that, and make a decision. So you have to draw credibility determinations that, did you believe this witness more than that witness?
Yeah.
You have to, a lot of times, reconcile information that maybe somebody testified to one thing, but the piece of paper says something else.
Okay.
Really making a lot of determinations about credibility and the facts. And I think sometimes it's hard when you're like, do I really hear and know, do I really have everything I need?
Right.
And sometimes, the parties, they try their case, and like you said, they have their vision of the case, and you think, boy, after the fact, what if I knew this, or was
Yeah.
there more information? I think it's just really feeling like, am I making the right decision? Because are you making the right, drawing the right conclusions from the facts and making the correct types of credibility decisions? I take it very seriously. I spend a lot of time on that because I think it's really, really important.
Oh, absolutely. Is there another level they can appeal to, or are you the ultimate determinator of, determination?
For every hearing, depending on whether it's an administrative hearing through an agency or a private arbitration or a arbitration through the Department of Labor, is that at the State Board of Mediation and Arbitration, they can move to vacate or move to confirm the arbitration award following the award.
Okay.
There is no true appeal like people think about going to the Supreme Court kind
Right.
of appeal.
Right.
Special education cases, the parties can't appeal that to a court. So
Okay.
there's different processes for pursuing that. There are certain types of hearings that once the hearing officer's ruled, that's it.
Okay.
That's the end of the road.
In terms of the skills that you need and the talents, right? I'm thinking certainly critical thinking skills as far as avoiding assumptions. And do you tape? I'm interested in how your notes, your conversations, et cetera, are documented. Others can review it perhaps or not. How does that work?
It depends on the hearing.
Okay.
Certain hearings have a court reporter, they're taking all of that down. So then
Okay.
there's a transcript. That's obviously a much easier thing to go back and say, what in fact did Georgianne say?
Yeah.
The transcript says this. Not all arbitrations or hearings have a court reporter.
Okay.
So I take very thorough notes on my laptop when I'm in a hearing. I'm, fast fingers on the keyboard taking those notes. Even if there is a court reporter, I do that. So to make sure that I'm capturing all that information.
So can people gain access to that through a Freedom of Information Act, or no?
No, not to my notes.
Okay.
No, my notes are not subject to that.
Okay, well, your judgments certainly, right?
Certainly the award, yes.
Okay, all right.
Yes.
Tell me about how you would categorize the different skill sets that you employ. And then we're going to talk about all these different jobs you've done that helped you get to this point.
One of the things that I enjoy about the work is I enjoy sort of the mental gymnastics of, hearing the evidence, thinking about the evidence, applying it to whether it's the law or a collective bargaining agreement or whatever the, sort of governing information is. So I really like that that process. I also like the process of helping people come to a resolution. And so giving people an opportunity to be heard and to clarify what their positions are and, get to that resolution. It is a lot of critical thinking. It's also a combination of understanding the law and applying the law, and a process of managing a hearing and managing people who want to speak, and are they speaking in the right order, and are people talking over top of one another, and did they get a fair chance to present their case, and, not cutting them off. So I think, managing the process, managing the hearing, and then spending the time on the decision.
Sure. So can you ask questions of people? Okay.
Absolutely.
So I imagine asking the right questions, right? There's
Yes.
a whole taxonomy around, right?
Yeah.
Levels of questions.
Absolutely.
I think would be very key. I would think could help engender some sense of people believing they're being treated fairly if they're being asked pertinent questions, right? And as you say, they get a chance to say their part.
To me, that's really, really important. Like in a special ed case, I might have a case where the school district is represented by an attorney. Well, they are represented by an attorney. And then a parent who's not represented by an attorney.
Right.
And this may be the first time they've been through this kind of process. They've never been in a situation. They come in, they see a court reporter, makes them nervous.
Right.
They're not sure how to proceed. They don't know about rules of evidence or process and those kind of things. And I can't try their case for them. That's not my
Right.
job. But I really want to make sure that all the parties, again, they feel heard, they have an opportunity to put on their evidence. So I might be able to guide them to some resources or suggestions, or, make sure that there's as level a playing field as possible, that they have an opportunity to get their case out. And I think, for me, I try to take pride in again, managing the process in a way that we don't spend a lot of time going over things that's just repetitive, and that, I don't need to hear the same thing over and over and over again. And so to be efficient in the hearing, but yet let people have an opportunity to get their case out. So I do ask questions. Sometimes I kind of have to guess of like, where is this parent going with this? I'm not really clear. So
Right.
sometimes I'll stop and say, okay, tell me, what was your concern or disagreement on this issue? Like, let's get through each of those issues and lay them out, and then ask about what information they have with regard to each of those and kind of break it down. Because I think it can be easy to come in and just be like, oh my gosh, this, and then this, and then this, and on Tuesday, and on when, and it's like really break those things down, because it is important that people feel heard. It's also important that even if they disagree with my decision, that they understand that their voice is in there. And so I always put in, this party's position is this, the other party's position is this, that they know that I heard them, and that then I have indicated why I do or don't agree with them. And so I think it's really important for them to be able to understand that they were heard and acknowledged, and that there was a basis for the decision, even if it was contrary to their position.
Some of these roles that you play, are there multiple stages, or is it always one thing where you're, like union negotiations, I would think, well, people are challenging a union issue, right? What I'm asking is it kind of a one and done type of situation usually, like that you're involved with?
So when I get a hearing, it's like, here's the issue. It might be one issue, it might be a number of issues, but I focus on those issues, I deal with that, and then I issue my decision and I move on.
Right.
So those parties may ultimately have other disagreements or other issues, but I may or may not get those cases. So
Okay.
when they come in, that case has a very specific set of issues and focus, and that's all that I focus on. And that's really important, that we're not going far afield. and that I'm not making decisions on things that were not squarely within the scope of that that
So a lot of
hearing.
boundary management there.
Yes.
Now let's get a little bit into what brought you to all of this. So you did have your own practice for about 8 years. You were an associate executive director for the Connecticut Bar Association, right? For another 8 years, and then you've done some other things as well. So let's take your own law practice. What experience did you have that you said, okay, maybe I would like to branch out and do something different?
I was a solo practitioner, and I was practicing primarily labor and employment law.
Okay.
And I did primarily individual employee rights, wrongful termination, discrimination, those kinds of things. In the course of my practice, I went to a lot of administrative hearings and arbitrations,
Okay.
whether it was a discrimination case before the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities or a case at the Department of Labor, say, for unemployment, is I was doing a lot of those hearings as an advocate. And I thought to myself, boy, that seems like a really good gig down the road, maybe a retirement gig, to be an impartial hearing officer or arbitrator. At some point, I decided, after practicing for 8 years, that that would be something that I would pursue. So I left the practice of law so that I could establish myself as a neutral, since I had obviously been an advocate for 8 years. And so that was when I went into these other positions, starting with the State Bar Association, and then moving ultimately from there to a private business and being there as their COO and then Chief Compliance Officer. And so while I was in those positions, I was building a practice as a hearing officer and an arbitrator.
Okay.
So I was doing that part-time, kind of on the side, taking vacation days to do it as I continued to work full-time for other people.
Okay, so you built another avenue for yourself. Okay.
Right. I started as an arbitrator for the Department of Consumer Protection on a part-time, sort of contract basis 25 years ago. That's how long I've been
that's quite a
doing it in
journey.
some capacity.
Yeah. Oh, that's neat.
Yeah.
And let's talk about your interests, your talents, like your educational experience. So my understanding is you started as a math major. You got your degree in psychology before you became a lawyer.
Correct.
Right. As we talked, it seems like that question of why was very dominant in each of those fields.
Yeah.
That really, attracted you in terms of, well, this might be something I could spend a lot of time with and have as my career. So how can you connect those dots for us, going from math to psychology to being a lawyer?
Yeah, I started as a math major. I really enjoyed math. I'm a numbers person. After my freshman year, I didn't have a vision of how that translated into a career.
Okay.
And felt a little lost about what that was. One of the things that very much interested me is how people learn, how people's behavior is impacted. I then switched in to be a psychology major. So
Okay.
I graduated then with a degree in psychology. And I always thought I would go on and get another degree. I was kind of burned out on school at that point, so I said, I just need to get a job.
Right.
So I got a job actually working as a computer programmer for a company, which is sort of another left turn from psychology. It kind of took me back to some of those math skills, those mental gymnastics, which I've always enjoyed, problem solving, games, puzzles, those kinds of things. So it was a little bit of exercising that part of my brain. And I was very fortunate in that when I first started my job as a computer programmer, is I worked for an organization that we did in-house data processing for banks and financial institutions. And I was selected early on to be on a special task force to look at how our clients utilized our software and their business processes. And it was great for me because I had an opportunity to say, why do you do your job this way? And how does your job impact that job? And how does somebody else's job impact your job? And so people would say, well, it takes me so long to do this task. And I would say, I don't understand. Why does it take that long? Like, I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, I could do this in half a day. Well, because they have to wait for the report from this person, or they have to wait for this, or they have to
So
wait for that.
workflow analysis.
It was all workflow analysis. You could just ask us to print 2 reports, and it was like, oh my gosh. On one hand, it's amazing because it seems like a simple thing.
Right.
But when you're so caught up in the day-to-day of what you do, you don't necessarily think outside
Right.
that bubble of, I need to get this done and this is what the process is set up.
Right.
Some people don't have the confidence to say, hey, why does this process look like this? They think of themselves more as the cog in the machine. So I think spending time in that capacity, I really had an opportunity to start my career with thinking about, why do we do things the way we do them? How do we behave in the workplace? How do we learn? And how do we make that work flow. And so that informed a lot of the jobs that then I did. And so I think the main theme through my career has been, as you talked about at the very beginning, is how can I help employees be better employees? And through that process, being better people in terms of their relationships with their coworkers, in terms of their relationships with their employment and their work, and their own sort of motivations and desires to succeed, desires to maybe advance, or to be content with what they're at, but to do it well.
Right.
Being able to take the opportunity, I think, to talk with people and work with people in problem solving in the workplace, whether it's between them and a peer, them and a manager, them and their work, and really just helping the organization and the people be their best.
So that was really kind of serendipity, right? I mean, in terms of falling into that role and then making, it really sounds like it really informed the way you, shaped what you were going to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, with the rest
Yeah,
of your career.
it really did. And I think I was very lucky in that sense, is to, 6 months out of college to be sitting in a situation. And part of me was like, I am not qualified to tell this person who's been doing their job for 15 years how to do their job.
Right.
But what I was qualified for, being completely uninformed on their job, is to say, why?
Yeah.
How? What about? Why not? And I think sometimes it seems like it's easier for us to solve other people's problems than our own, right?
Sure.
Is to be able to look at it, because I'm looking at it more objectively and from, sort of an arm's length away. Just being able to then take that sort of aha moment of, oh, I can apply this to a lot of things in my life, and help other people in theirs to do the same thing.
So that's a great recognition, it sounds like, at a fairly early stage of your life and your career,
Yeah.
to have that recognition. And then of how this is all percolating in your brain. What inspired you to go into the legal field?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I even still really know the answer.
Okay.
I knew that when I took the job as a computer programmer that I didn't want to be a computer programmer for the rest of my life.
Right.
And I was very fortunate, because I did have, like I said, some great opportunities with that company to do some interesting things outside of pure coding. But I knew that that was not a long-term thing. So I started thinking about what's next. And I kind of went back to, what are the things I'm good at? What are the things I enjoy? What are the things that get me charged up, about getting up in the morning? Again, the mental gymnastics, the problem solving, but there has to be a people component to it. I started thinking about what that might be. And I knew somebody who was taking the LSAT, and I thought, oh, that sounds like fun, right? I'll do that. I'm a good test taker, and I did. A few years later was when I was thinking, like, what am I going to do? What's next? And I was like, what? I took the LSAT a few years ago, so I thought that seems like an avenue. I thought that the practice of law certainly meets that problem solving, that mental gymnastics aspect, but also would give me an opportunity to do something that I thought was giving back and valuable to people and to the community.
So really kind of high-tech, high-touch.
Yeah.
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 Oh, that's terrific.
Yeah.
And you are very involved in the community of New Britain in particular. We've talked about you're from the Midwest originally, and you're on a lot of different boards. What do you find satisfying about that? Because that's a lot of work for volunteer.
It can be a lot of work. Well, I think, again, is that being part of a community is very important to me, whether that's my neighborhood, my city, any other affiliation that I may have through different groups I'm involved with. That's really important, and I think I'm very fortunate to have the opportunity to have the time, energy, and expertise to serve on a board. I grew up in a model of volunteering. My family, it's like if somebody asked and there was something we could do, yes, the answer is yes. I think just that sense of giving back to the community, of being part of the community, being able to use a skill set in a different way. And certainly there's many of the similar kinds of skill sets I use in my work that I bring to a different board. And sometimes it's wearing my compliance hat and being on a compliance committee, or maybe it's the days of overseeing HR and recruiting as a COO when helping an organization find a new CEO, or whatever it is that I have a skill set, and so I think it's important for me to give that back to the community. And it's great because I've met many people, yourself included, and so it's really expanded my community as well to serve on different boards.
It certainly sounds like you've been reflective throughout your life, which is wonderful because that doesn't always come to people so early on. What advice would you give yourself at, say, 25 or midlife?
I think it would be to believe in yourself and trust that gut instinct, and don't worry about what everybody else is doing. I think it's so easy to say whether it's the fashion trend or who's doing this or who's going to that school or who's getting this job, is to look outwardly for figuring out what you want. And that's important. I think it's important to look externally, but it's also really important to look internally. And so I think trust your gut, trust yourself. I think people look sometimes at my experience and it's like, oh, this looks like this kind of crazy route through things, but every time there's been sort of a core value or a thing that's important to me that has connected all those dots. So I think knowing what that core value is, knowing what your priorities are, connecting those dots for yourself and not waiting for other people to do that.
Well, that's self-sufficiency. That's excellent. And do you have a favorite quote you can share with us or saying?
Well, I think one thing that people who have worked with me know, that sort of my mantra is that everything we do should be positive and productive. And so that's one thing that I try to use in my own life and encourage others to do as well. So I think that's that's a way that I try and live my life.
That's where you come from, and yeah, right, your
Very
starting
much.
point
Very much.
and helping others
Very
be their
much
very
so.
best selves. Well, thank you so much for being a terrific guest.
Thank you.
And please tune in to hear other fascinating women tell their stories on Midlife Matters. I'm Georgianne Lucier, your host, and thank you for joining us.